There is some other news we're following tonight. Billionaire Jeffrey Epstein is expected to appear in federal court in Lower Manhattan tomorrow following new charges related to alleged sex crimes involving minors. Eyewitness News reporter Lucy Yang has the story.
His mansion on East 71st Street was raided early Sunday morning as agents hauled out multiple bags of evidence from disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein. We're told the 66-year-old registered sex offender had just landed at Teterboro Airport on Saturday, returning home from France when he was arrested.
He asked me to get comfortable, to take, my clothes off.
Courtney Wild says she was only 14 when she was allegedly abused by Epstein.
I had braces on. I remember standing in his kitchen and he also had a lot of girls there all the time.
The billionaire had money and political connections, but authorities say he also liked young, underage girls. The first time prosecutors went after him in Florida for allegedly sex trafficking minors, they struck a secret plea bargain where Epstein would serve 13 months and register as a sex offender. That so-called sweetheart deal drew blistering criticisms from victims who said they were never consulted. A federal judge this year agreed the women's rights were violated.
The number of girls that have been put into therapy because of this one individual or this group of individuals is just astronomical.
Jeffrey Epstein went from teacher to Wall Street to uber wealthy, but if he thought he was free to enjoy his lifestyle again, Epstein is now in a cell awaiting another criminal case, this time in New York. The charges to be revealed in Manhattan federal court on Monday. You can see his initials JE at the entrance to his mansion and his now splintered front door. If critics thought the first trial was a joke, this second case will be much more closely watched, especially after the Me Too movement.
On August 10th, 2019, one of the most powerful and mysterious men in the world was found dead inside a jail cell. A man who partied with billionaires. A man photographed with presidents. A man connected to royalty. A man who, for decades, seemed completely untouchable. And yet, he died alone. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. But almost immediately, people around the world started asking the same question. How did a man with that much power, that many secrets, and that many connections end up dead before ever standing trial? Tonight on Rise in Crime, we're diving deep into the disturbing story of Jeffrey Epstein. How he became rich, how he built influence at the highest levels of society, the shocking criminal network surrounding him, and the scandals that shook the world. Because Epstein's story isn't just about crime. It's about power, money, influence, and a system that for decades allowed him to operate in plain sight. To understand how all of this happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Long before the private jets, before the island, before the headlines, back to Brooklyn. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born January 20th, 1953 in Coney Island, New York. Not exactly the place you'd expect to find the origins of a future billionaire surrounded by the world's elite. His father worked as a groundskeeper for New York City parks. His mother was a school aide. They lived in a modest apartment, a working-class life, far from the luxury Epstein would later claim as his own. But from an early age, Epstein showed something that would define his future: an unusual confidence in his intelligence. He was especially gifted in mathematics. Teachers described him as quiet, focused, and extremely capable. He skipped grades and moved quickly through school, and on the surface, he looked like a success story in the making. But what's interesting about Epstein's early life isn't just what we know, it's what we don't know. Because even in his youth, there are gaps, missing details, and unanswered questions, a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. After graduating high school, Epstein attended Cooper Union, then later New York University. But here's the first strange twist in his story. He never graduated, no degree, no impressive academic credentials, nothing that would normally open doors to elite careers. And yet, somehow, doors kept opening for him. In the mid-1970s, Epstein landed a job at one of the most prestigious private schools in Manhattan, the Dalton School. This was a school for the children of New York's wealthiest families, the future CEOs, the future politicians, the children of enormous power. And Epstein was hired to teach there. There was just one problem. He had no college degree, no teaching license, no formal qualifications, but he had confidence, like he had charm, and he impressed the school's headmaster enough to get the job. And this moment would quietly change everything. Because Dalton gave Epstein something far more valuable than a paycheck. It gave him access to wealth, access to elite social circles, access to a world he would spend the rest of his life trying to dominate. But Epstein's time at Dalton didn't last long. After only a couple of years, he suddenly left the school. The exact reason has never been fully explained. No clear records, no public details, and once again, the pattern appears: questions without answers. But what happened next would launch him into a completely different world. In 1976, Epstein walked into one of the most powerful financial institutions in America, Bear Stearns, and somehow he got hired. No finance degree, no background in banking, no experience, just confidence and persuasion. At Bear Stearns, Epstein began working with wealthy clients, specializing in complex tax strategies and financial planning for the ultra-rich. He quickly gained a reputation for understanding how powerful people thought, what they wanted, what they feared, and how to make them trust him. He wasn't just selling financial advice, he was selling himself. And people bought it. Within just a few years, Epstein rose rapidly inside the company. He worked with millionaires, then billionaires, then individuals whose wealth and influence stretched across governments and industries. He learned how the rich protect their money, how they hide it, how they move it, how power really works behind closed doors. And more importantly, he learned how to make himself indispensable. But in 1981, his time at Bear Stearns suddenly ended. Once again, the details remain unclear. Some reports suggest regulatory concerns, others suggest internal issues. Nothing was ever fully explained, but instead of ending his career, it gave him an opportunity. Because from this moment forward, Epstein would begin creating his own mysterious financial empire. An empire no one fully understood. In the early 1980s, Epstein launched his own financial consulting business. And this is where his story becomes extremely strange. He claimed he only worked with billionaires. He claimed he helped clients recover stolen money. He claimed he managed enormous private fortunes. But no one could ever clearly explain how his business actually worked. There were no public records of major deals, no clear list of clients, no transparent source of his wealth. And yet, he became incredibly rich. He purchased massive homes in Manhattan, Palm Beach, New Mexico, Paris, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. He traveled by private jet. He moved effortlessly among the global elite. It was wealth without a clear origin, power without transparency, influence without explanation. And this is the moment where the story begins to shift. Because as Epstein's wealth and influence grew, so did disturbing allegations about his private life. Rumors began circulating, stories whispered among staff, unusual behavior noticed by employees and visitors. But for years, nothing stuck. Because Epstein had something more powerful than money. He had connections. and those connections would protect him for a very long time. But behind the mansions, behind the private jets, behind the image of a brilliant financial mastermind, a hidden operation was already taking shape. One that would eventually expose one of the largest and most disturbing abuse scandals in modern history. And when the truth finally began to surface, it would shock the world. By the early 1980s, Jeffrey Epstein had done something almost impossible. He had built enormous wealth. Without a clearly defined business, no public company, no obvious product, no transparent financial empire. And yet, he was suddenly living like one of the richest men in America. So how did he do it? The answer may lie in the people he surrounded himself with. Because Epstein wasn't just building wealth. He was building a network. As his money grew, Epstein began moving into elite social circles. The kind of rooms where power quietly shapes the world. He attended exclusive parties, private dinners, high-level social events attended by politicians, academics, celebrities, and global business leaders. He became known as a man who could introduce you to the right people, a connector, a facilitator, a man who seemed to know everyone. And one of the most important connections he would ever make came in the mid-1980s, a connection that would change everything. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. Daughter of British media tycoon Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine grew up surrounded by privilege, influence, and immense wealth. Her father owned newspapers, moved among world leaders, and lived a life of extraordinary power. But in 1991, Robert Maxwell died under mysterious circumstances after falling from his yacht. His death revealed something shocking. He had secretly stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from employee pension funds. His business empire collapsed almost overnight. And suddenly, Ghislaine Maxwell's world changed. She moved to New York, and not long after arriving, she met Jeffrey Epstein. Their relationship quickly became close. Some described them as romantic partners. Others described them as business associates. Some said she was his social gateway into elite circles. Whatever the truth was, one thing became clear. They were inseparable. Maxwell helped manage Epstein's homes. She introduced him to powerful people. She helped craft his image as a sophisticated financier and intellectual. Together, they created an environment of luxury, influence, and exclusivity. But investigators would later claim their partnership was something far darker. Because according to numerous allegations, Maxwell would play a central role in recruiting young girls for Epstein. At the time, however, none of that was public. To the outside world, they were simply part of New York's elite. Throughout the 1990s, Epstein's power grew dramatically. He purchased one of the largest private residences in Manhattan, a massive townhouse reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars. He acquired a private Caribbean island. He owned multiple aircraft, including a private jet that would later become infamous in media reports. He hosted gatherings filled with powerful guests, scientists, politicians, royalty, and billionaires. And he carefully crafted an image of himself as more than just a financier. He presented himself as an intellectual, a patron of science, a supporter of academic research. He donated money to universities and research institutions. He hosted discussions with prominent thinkers. He positioned himself as someone shaping the future of humanity. It was an image that gave him credibility, respectability, protection. But behind the image, disturbing patterns were emerging. Staff members at Epstein's homes would later describe unusual instructions, young girls visiting frequently, private massage arranged regularly, strict secrecy about what occurred inside. Multiple employees would later say they witnessed behavior that made them uncomfortable, but at the time, few spoke publicly, because Epstein was powerful, and powerful people often operate without challenge. By the mid-1990s, according to later testimony, a system was already in place. Young girls, many from vulnerable backgrounds, were allegedly recruited to give Epstein massages at his homes. They were often paid, and investigators would later claim some were encouraged to recruit other girls, creating a growing network, a system hidden behind wealth, influence, and silence. For years, it remained largely invisible to the public, but that would eventually change. The first major public warning came in 2005. A mother in Palm Beach, Florida, contacted police after her 14-year-old daughter reported disturbing encounters with Epstein. What followed would become one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern history. Police began interviewing potential victims, and what they found was alarming. Multiple girls described similar experiences. They described being recruited, paid for massages, pressured into sexual acts, told to bring other girls. Investigators quickly realized this was not an isolated incident. It appeared to be a pattern, a system. The Palm Beach Police Department gathered extensive evidence. Detectives interviewed numerous witnesses. They collected statements. They recommended serious charges. Local investigators believed Epstein should face multiple felony counts related to abuse of minors. But the case would soon take a dramatic turn, because Epstein's legal team was extraordinary. He hired powerful attorneys, high-profile defense lawyers, legal experts with deep connections, and behind the scenes, negotiations began. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial agreement with federal prosecutors, a plea deal. Instead of facing severe federal charges that could have resulted in life in prison, Epstein pleaded guilty to lesser state charges. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail. But even that sentence came with unusual conditions. He was allowed to leave jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for work release. He served just 13 months. And perhaps most controversially, the agreement granted immunity to potential co-conspirators. Many victims and investigators were never informed the deal was being negotiated. The decision sparked outrage, but at the time, Epstein walked free. And that moment would change everything, because the message was clear. Even when accused of serious crimes, Jeffrey Epstein remained protected. After his release, Epstein returned to his life of wealth and influence. He continued hosting events. He continued traveling. He continued meeting powerful figures. Some individuals distanced themselves, others did not. Despite his conviction, Epstein maintained connections in elite circles, a fact that would later fuel enormous public anger when his case resurfaced years later. But the story was far from over, because many of the victims refused to stay silent. Journalists began investigating, civil lawsuits emerged, new witnesses came forward, and slowly the world began paying attention. Then in 2019, more than a decade after his controversial plea deal, everything changed. Federal prosecutors announced new charges, serious charges, charges that would bring Epstein back into custody and place him at the center of global attention. This time, the scrutiny would be unlike anything he had ever faced, and within weeks, he would be dead. But how did the case reopen? What new evidence emerged? And what really happened inside that jail cell in 2019? Because Epstein's final chapter would raise more questions than answers. And some of those questions remain unresolved to this day. Even after his 2008 conviction, even after the plea deal, even after serving time in jail. The story of Jeffrey Epstein refused to disappear. Because while he had avoided the full force of federal prosecution, many of the victims had not given up. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. And eventually, they found someone willing to listen. In the years following Epstein's release, civil lawsuits began quietly moving through the courts. Victims came forward describing disturbing experiences. stories of recruitment, manipulation, and abuse. Their accounts shared striking similarities. But for a long time, the story struggled to gain widespread attention. That would change because of one journalist. Her name was Julie K. Brown. Working for the Miami Herald, Brown began investigating Epstein's case years after his plea deal. What she discovered would shock even experienced investigators. She uncovered internal documents, police reports, court filings, testimony from victims, and most importantly, she gave survivors a platform to speak. In 2018, Brown published a series of explosive investigative reports. Her work revealed the extent of Epstein's alleged network. It exposed how many victims had come forward. It examined the controversial 2008 plea deal and the unusual protections it granted. The reporting sparked massive public outrage. People wanted to know, how had a man accused of abusing dozens of minors received such a lenient sentence? Why had potential co-conspirators been granted immunity? And how had Epstein been allowed to return to a life of luxury afterward? The pressure quickly intensified, and soon, federal authorities reopened the case. In July 2019, more than a decade after his plea deal, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at a New Jersey airport after returning from Paris. This time, the charges were federal. Prosecutors accused him of operating a sex trafficking operation involving underage girls between 2002 and 2005. The indictment described a disturbing system. Young girls recruited from vulnerable situations, payments for sexual acts, a network of recruiters, multiple locations used for abuse. Authorities also searched Epstein's Manhattan mansion. Inside, investigators reportedly found large amounts of cash, diamonds, and photographs of young girls. The world was watching, and for the first time, it appeared Epstein might finally face full accountability. He pleaded not guilty, and he was denied bail. Jeffrey Epstein was placed in federal custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, a high-security facility, a place designed to hold some of the most dangerous defendants in the country. But within weeks, strange events began unfolding. On July 23, 2019, Epstein was found injured in his cell with marks around his neck. Officials initially described the incident as a possible suicide attempt, but details remained unclear. Reports suggested surveillance footage was missing or unusable. Questions emerged about staffing levels. Conflicting accounts appeared. Epstein was placed on suicide watch, a status that typically involves constant monitoring. And then unexpectedly, he was removed from suicide watch not long afterward. On the morning of August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging, but almost immediately a controversy erupted. The circumstances raised serious questions. 2 guards assigned to monitor Epstein had reportedly fallen asleep. Required security checks were not performed. Cameras near his cell had malfunctioned. For a prisoner facing some of the most high-profile charges in modern history, the failures seemed extraordinary. The public reaction was immediate. Many questioned how such a high-profile detainee could die under those conditions. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly across the internet. Government officials promised investigations. But for many people, Epstein's death created more questions than answers. With Epstein gone, attention shifted to those around him. Who else had been involved? Who had known? Who had helped? And one name quickly became central to the investigation: Ghislaine Maxwell. For years, victims had accused Maxwell of playing a crucial role in Epstein's operation, recruiting young girls, gaining their trust, and facilitating abuse. In July 2020, she was arrested by federal authorities, She was later charged with multiple counts related to the recruitment and trafficking of minors. In 2021, after a highly publicized trial, Maxwell was convicted on several charges and later sentenced to prison. Her conviction confirmed what many victims had long claimed, that Epstein had not acted alone. But even with Maxwell convicted, many questions remained unanswered. Who funded Epstein's mysterious wealth? How did he maintain powerful connections for so long? Why had warning signs been ignored for decades? And how many victims were never identified? These questions continue to shape public discussion about the case. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not just the story of one man. It's a story about systems of power, about influence and protection, about how wealth can create barriers to accountability. And perhaps most disturbingly, it's a story about how many warning signs were visible long before action was taken. Even today, the full truth may never be completely known, but the impact of the case continues to ripple across governments, institutions, and global conversations about power and justice. Jeffrey Epstein was gone, dead before trial, dead before full testimony, dead before many victims ever got their day in court. But the story didn't end in that jail cell, because the secrets he left behind were still locked away in court records, investigations, and sealed documents, and the world wanted to know what was inside. For years, journalists, victims, and advocacy groups pushed for transparency. They wanted documents released, names revealed, connections examined, and gradually, through lawsuits and court rulings, thousands of pages of records began to surface. Among the most talked about were documents connected to lawsuits involving Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein, including depositions, witness statements, and previously sealed records. In 2024 and continuing afterward, courts ordered the release of additional files tied to Epstein's network. The media quickly labeled them Epstein files, and the public reaction was immediate. It's important to understand what these documents actually were. They included witness testimony, flight logs, court filings, depositions, contact records, investigative material. And within those documents were references to hundreds of individuals, politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and public figures. But the presence of a name in court records did not mean criminal wrongdoing. Some were witnesses, some had limited social contact, some were mentioned by others in testimony. Some were never accused of crimes at all. Still, the revelations showed something deeply unsettling. Epstein's social network had reached into the highest levels of global power. The documents confirmed what many had long suspected. Epstein had built relationships with influential people across government, finance, academia, entertainment, and international politics. His world was one where wealth and influence overlapped, where access to power was currency. And for many observers, that realization was deeply disturbing because it raised a haunting question. How had one man embedded himself so deeply within global power structures? The release of these records had a massive cultural impact. News coverage spread across the world. Online debates exploded. Public trust in institutions was shaken. For some, the files reinforced fears about elite protection and hidden power networks. For others, they highlighted the importance of due process and the danger of assuming guilt without evidence. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The Epstein case had permanently changed how people viewed wealth, influence, and accountability. Governments faced pressure to strengthen protections against trafficking. Law enforcement agencies re-examined how abuse cases involving powerful suspects are handled. Media organizations increased investigative reporting into institutional failures, and survivors of abuse found new platforms to share their stories. The case became a global symbol, not just of crime, but of systemic failure. A reminder that justice can be complicated when power is involved, and yet despite years of investigation, many questions remain unanswered. How did Epstein accumulate such vast wealth with so little transparency? Who truly enabled his operations? Were there others who were never identified? Why did warnings go unheeded for so long? The full truth may never be completely known, but there is one thing we do know. Jeffrey Epstein's power did not last forever. His wealth could not protect him indefinitely. His influence could not silence every voice. And the victims he once controlled ultimately helped expose him. Their testimonies changed history. Their courage forced accountability. Their persistence ensured that the world would never forget. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not just about one man's crimes. It is a warning about unchecked power, a warning about systems that protect influence over truth, a warning about how easily wealth can create silence, but it is also a story about exposure, about persistence, about investigation, about survivors refusing to stay quiet, because in the end, the same thing that allowed Epstein to rise, secrecy, became the force that led to his downfall. The files were opened. The world looked closer. And the illusion of untouchable power was shattered. Justice, in this case, was incomplete. But the truth, piece by piece, came into the light. And sometimes, that is where real accountability begins. This has been Rise in Crime, and this story reminds us that behind wealth, influence, and power, the truth always waits to be uncovered,